3 o'clock, ready for our next talk. Allison Lacker will be telling you about how to learn while still being productive. So let's give her a warm welcome.
Yes, there we go. All that fiddling with the microphone was for nothing. So, hi everyone, I'm Allison Lacker. I'm really loud now. I'm a software engineer at Eventbrite, and this is kind of partly my journey of how I learned Python while being at a company, but also just kind of techniques on how to learn and balance your time. So, why do you care? Why do I know anything? Well, first of all, I'm from Ohio, so that makes me trustworthy, right? My degree in computer science is from UIUC. After that, I spent 2 years in Cameroon with the Peace Corps teaching people how to use computers. And then came back, moved to San Francisco, and started work at Eventbrite. And that was almost 3 years ago. And none of that is why you should listen to me. That is all the successes. You can listen to me because at each point in those stages, I knew nothing, especially Ohio, but high school's hard for everyone. So why is it important? Why is learning new things important? To which you say, what sort of programmer are you? Don't you know our field moves quickly, and don't you know there's so many cool things out there that you could be learning? It's like, well, yeah, okay, but you could sit in a corner and learn new things and hack, but why does your company want you to learn? Why is it important to always be learning at your company? I'm not sure if any of you have heard this term. Maybe everyone knows it. I didn't know it until I moved out to San Francisco. Bus factor is not being awesome. It's not spinning around in circles. The bus factor is rather morbid, in fact, and it says, will your team survive if somebody gets hit by a bus? So you have a very low bus factor if one person knows everything. And you might think, oh, that one person who knows everything about payments, they're the only one. They're busy all the time. I shouldn't bother them. No, that's exactly the wrong thing. That's exactly the person you should be asking questions to, because that's the only one person who knows it. If he gets hit by a bus, or more likely, if he goes on vacation, no one will be able to fix anything. I knew this personally. There was a short period of time where I was the only one who knew anything about our search systems. And during that time, I also got the flu. And I was lying in bed with 102-degree fever, and things stopped working. And I had to hang out with our head of ops and be very sad while debugging code. And then, as soon as I came back, I started teaching other people. So it's in everyone's best interest if more people know things. Another fun tech term is unicorns. This is often used in hiring to describe somebody with exactly the skills you need. And they're called unicorns because they're almost impossible to find. They are also called purple squirrels or various other things, sometimes purple unicorns. And usually, unicorns are people who are full stack. But full stack means different things to different people. There was a fun interaction when I moved to the data team where the data engineers and I were discussing an API, and I was purely front-end at the time, and they were saying, okay, we want to give you 5 different endpoints. And I was like, well, no, that'd be really bad for performance. I want just one endpoint. We went back and forth, and they're like, okay, fine. And eventually, they gave me one endpoint, but what I didn't realize is they meant one endpoint into their data system. I was thinking one Python endpoint, and they considered Python to be front-end, and I considered it to be back-end. So even the same terms mean different things to everyone. I kind of threw a bunch of things on this page that I know. In school, we did a lot of stuff like Java and MIPS and OCaml, Then my first programming job, it was HTML and CSS and lots of SQL. Then at Eventbrite, I did JavaScript and started learning Python. Fun story in between here. One of my friends said I really needed to learn a scripting language, and so I chose Ruby, which I've never used since. And then, as I was at Eventbrite longer, I've done Solr and Cassandra and Redis and Hadoop. And that barely encapsulates what I use on a daily basis. This is what I did Thursday before I came out here. I started writing down the different programs and technologies I use. And these don't come instantaneously. You need to learn how to use Docker. You need to learn how to use Sublime or Vim. And maybe other people don't use the same tools you do. Maybe somebody would come up to me and say, how do I do a query in Solr? And since I spend 60% of my time using Solr, I'd be like, oh, you don't know how to query in Solr, it's so simple. And then they'll tell me to do something in Emacs, and I have no clue. So how do you learn all of those things? Well, not at once. Those are over a long period of time. Although I use mostly all of this in my daily job, except for everything I learned in school. I don't do any of that. So how do you learn? One thing at a time, which is way more important than it sounds. You could try to do 2 different technologies at once, and it'll take you a lot longer. So ideally, the projects that you're working on will introduce a new technology. When I came to Eventbrite, my tech lead at the time said, okay, build us a feature in Python. I was like, but I don't know how to use Python. He's like, it'll be fine, just do it. And it was fine, I just did it. But the more important thing is always something. So when I first started, I spent the first month or 2 doing CSS. And I was really good at CSS. And I did a lot of stuff. And I was frustrated, and I wasn't learning anything. And I went to my manager and said, hey, I'm only doing CSS all the time. What's up with this? He's like, well, here, have all these other tickets. And so it was just me not asking. And that communication's really important. I don't know what the demographic is in here, but if any of you, though, are managers or tech leads or senior engineers or anyone who is making schedules for other people, keep this in mind. If you're not, tell your managers or whoever's making your schedule or whoever determines what you're working on that you want to learn new things. I spend a lot of time figuring out what other people are going to work on, and it's a lot harder than it seems. So when I went to Cameroon, I actually got classes in pedagogy, which is an entire field of study figuring out how people learn. And my 3 months of learning about it was still nothing compared to the people who spend their lifetimes, but what I learned can be summed up in people learn different ways. And because we're human, we like to categorize things. So I'm going to use the kind of standard visual, auditory, and kinesthetic learners. People tend to prefer one of these. And I'm going to just kind of throw all the computer science stuff into different areas. So visual could be watching somebody code something. It could be reading books. It could be watching different seminars online. I have stacks of programming books. They're great. They keep my desk flat. One time, my internet was out for a week, and I actually referenced one for some algorithms, but that's kind of an exception. My roommate buys a new programming book about once a month and actually reads it cover to cover. I don't know how he does it, but he learns a lot that way. Auditory, right now, if you're listening to me, you could just be reading the slides. Maybe you'll be getting some different things out of it. Online classes or talking to people. The important thing with talking to people is to keep in mind that communication's hard. And you might think you're saying the same things, or you might think you're listening, and maybe it's not quite the same. For example, if I was giving this talk in San Francisco, and I said OSU, everyone would assume I'm talking about Oregon State. From Ohio, that actually took me a while to figure out, because OSU obviously is Ohio State. Another thing is make sure you ask questions early. I got a ticket one time that was asking me to cache a function call. And it described why. It said, we're calling this function many times on every request. We only need to call it once. I said, OK, I can fix that. And I wrote a system to cache where I stored data in Redis, and I pulled it out again. And I put up a review, and somebody just did a one-line comment that said, why don't you just use our memcache decorator? It's like, oh, days wasted. So communication's good. Kinesthetic. Most people are kinesthetic learners. This means instead of reading about bridges, you actually go and build one. In programming terms, that'd be hacking on projects, not reading about it, doing it. Implementing tutorials and things like that. What I love doing is drawing on whiteboards. People will talk to me, and it'll go in one ear and out the other, and I'll say, let's draw it. And it's way easier for me to figure it out. Also, Post-it notes. I used to have 2 monitors, and one was just always dedicated to putting Post-it notes on it until my coworkers got mad at me, and they took it away. I have a whiteboard now, it's okay. But the important thing is, no one actually only uses one. People use all of them. So even if you're primarily a kinesthetic learner, you're gonna need some auditory things. You're gonna look at Stack Overflow. That's visual. What's important is just figuring out what works best for you, and then communicating it. If you do learn best by reading, and you get a new project that says, implement a thing in Python, and you've never used Python, maybe you wanna spend a day reading up on it. What's important is to tell your manager and work with them and say, hey, I have no idea what any of this is. I wanna learn. Give me a day. And if they're any good at all, they'll say definitely. But also what's important is to make sure you time box things. So don't go and spend a week reading books about Python. You might be going down the wrong path. Don't spend a week implementing your own caching system. It might already exist. One of my favorite pieces of advice that I ever got was, if you're struggling on something for an hour, go ask somebody. Before that, try and figure it out yourself, and then ask somebody. Maybe they'll just give you a tip to go in the correct direction. Maybe they'll give you the solution. But it ensures that you spend enough time to try and figure it out. You're not wasting anyone else's time, but you're also making sure you're moving forward. So great. You now have learned everything about Python ever. You know everything. And you're going to forget it tomorrow, right? So, in the words of the immortal Adam Savage, write it down. As I mentioned before, I love Post-it notes. They're everywhere. But what's really great about writing things down is it's notes for yourself. It helps you remember. It's documentation for other people if they need it. And also make bug reports. Sometimes if you're setting up your dev environment and it doesn't work, it's not your fault. It might be something wrong with something else. And it's really easy to be like, oh, okay, I fixed it for me, done. I don't have to think about it anymore. And then you have a new hire start the next week and they run through the same thing, and everyone's time is wasted. Something else I love, if you haven't noticed from my slides, are lists. I write lists for everything. I write lists for what I have to pack, I write lists for what I have to do. When learning, I like to keep 2 lists. One for what I've already learned, and one for what I want to be learning. So when I first started, I had this Google Doc, and I wrote down everything that I had to ask anyone twice. And I kept a secret, because I thought it was bad that I didn't remember how to get my development environment working, or where to find the logs, or where the scripts were. So I had this all hidden in this Google Doc. And then I found out a few months later, everyone had these. So I actually still reference mine now. There's things that the first week I was embarrassed that I didn't know, and I still don't remember it. I look at our logs once a month, and in that time, I've forgotten exactly where they are. And that's fine. It's also great as documentation for the next new people. What else are they going to need to know? Whatever you had to go through, if your development environment didn't work, maybe the documentation didn't remind you to install pip. And then you need to know that. It's also really great because it's really easy to get caught up in what you haven't learned or what you haven't done. Maybe you have a project and you're like, I've made no commits in the last 4 days. And then you look at your lists and you're like, whoa, but in that time, I've learned how to write class-based views and what memcache is and all these other things. My other list is what I want to learn. So it's really easy to tangent. Maybe you're learning about SQL and you just want to figure out one thing. And then it links to an article about how to optimize it. And that links to an article about how to do it at 10 times the scale. When you're trying to learn a basic SQL command, it's not the time to go down that path. But those are all really, really important things to know. So write it down, and when you have some spare time, go back to it. One of the best things to do after you've learned something is to teach it. It helps you make sure that you're right, because at least every time that I've had to teach something, I go and research it like crazy. Because if it's just me, it's okay, I can be wrong. If I'm telling other people what to do, and then they say, but Allison told me to do it that way, then I can't have that happening. So I always make sure I really know what I'm talking about when I'm teaching. Also, people who have just learned something are actually some of the best people to teach it. And that's because they just had to go through it themselves. So they remember all those weird things that were tricky. They remember what was annoying for them. And there's none of that, oh, you don't know Solar? Ugh. So kind of the takeaways from this are just figure out what works for you. The same thing is not the same for everyone. Take the time you need to learn. If the title of this is How to Learn While Still Being Productive, the point is learning is productive, as long as you're still going towards the correct goal. And be honest with yourself and other people. If you don't know something, say it. If you do know something, help other people. And just figure out where you are and acknowledge that you're learning and acknowledge all the awesome things that you figured out. So these are kind of the things that have worked for me, that have worked for people I've talked to. But like I said, not everyone's the same. And I would love feedback, especially as I work with people. I want to be able to help everyone. So tell me what works for you, if this works, if it doesn't. Tweet at me or send me an email. I was not the first Allison at Eventbrite or even in engineering, so I'm Allie at. But send me an email and I'd love to hear from you, or ask questions now if you have any. There's a question in the back.
I really liked your tip about keeping track of things that you're learning, and I had kind of ignored that first bit about doing only one thing at one time, and I was going kind of crazy, so I started writing things down to keep track of things that I'm learning. But what I'm finding is that I have a really difficult time making sure that I go back to that list and revisit it to make sure that I'm still exploring and learning. What is one of the things that's worked for you to make sure that you're continuing to revisit the list and that it's not just like a list that you add to, but you never really go back and revisit those things? It just becomes like a longer list.
Yeah, so one of the things I actually mentioned was, where is it? Or I didn't actually say it, it's just secretly on this list. So it reminds you of that other time you wanted to learn something. So one thing that I found is I might be like, oh, like read up on optimizing SQL, and then it'll go on my list, and maybe I don't follow up with it right away. And then I have some other ticket, and I see it again. And I'm like, oh, this was really important before. I need to visit it now. And that's kind of justification for when to do it immediately versus when to put it on that list. But you'll also find that maybe when you're first doing something, you have lots of things on this list, and then it'll just slowly get accomplished. I just encourage you to not get overwhelmed by all the things you can learn, because there's infinite things. My list of what I know was long. It's not everything I know, and it's still nothing compared to lots of people. There's so many more things out there that I could know, like COBOL. Anything else?
So you mentioned that you and your coworkers all have these cheat sheets of a list of things that you don't remember. Have you figured out a way to share that across so that it's not everyone creating the same list for your team or department or whatever?
Yeah, we have startup documentation. So we have a lot of things that are like, follow this to get started on your development environment. And that's what I think it's really important to go and update, especially as a new developer, when you find things wrong with it. Something else that's interesting is each team has slightly different documents shared among them. Like the logs I look at are different than another team's logs might be, things like that. And some of them have documentation. One thing we really need to do is get better at the search we have on our documentation, because it's really difficult to find things. So I found eventually my doc with things is really just links to places in the documentation. I think one of the most effective ways to make that better would be to make that search better. But it might be something like if you searched for OCaml, it wouldn't show up because of the capitalization. It's a pretty bad documentation system.